to you live as we begin the first of 3 days of memorial ceremonies for former First Lady Rosalynn Carter.
Yeah, so right now the Carter family motorcade is arriving at Phoebe Sumter Medical Center in Americus. Mrs. Carter's remains will be transferred to a hearse accompanied by past and present members of her U.S. Secret Service detail.
You know, you already see some flowers and people lining the way. This again is Americus, Georgia, a small town relatively, 16,000 people, but there is so much history just at this one place at the university where Mrs. Carter went to school. She was just a graduate when she married former President Jimmy Carter, and her legacy has continued on in such a strong way as we see the police officers riding by right there on their motorcycles.
And you know, it's just so great to see Mrs. Carter. She was born in Plains. She died here in Plains. She spent a majority of her life here in Plains, like you said. Her and Jimmy actually growing up not too far from each other. I believe they were right next door. Jimmy's mom helped to deliver her as a baby, and then they met in their teens and they got married and really just had a really strong life. People love Mrs. Carter. Yeah,
and because she had a lifelong commitment to really empower people who often felt like they weren't seen, caregivers, people dealing with mental health issues, and people who loved people with, you know, who were dealing with mental health issues, which is why this is such a significant place that they are at today at this Georgia Southern University, because this is where her Institute for Caregivers is, and the work has been done in so many ways. This looks like the hearse carrying the body of former First Lady Rosalynn Carter, 96 years old, passed away after a battle with dementia, and a courageous decision to share that publicly in line with the work she did through her entire adult life, shedding light on issues dealing with mental health and caregiving as she went into home hospice in those final days of her life as well.
Yeah, and Cheryl, as we take a look here, you can just get a sense of the energy, the feeling down in Plains as they head to the wreath laying ceremony. I mean, if you head to Plains, and we've done a lot of reporting in the months since Mr. Carter was announced that he was going to go to hospice care all the way until now, just over a week when we've announced the death of Mrs. Carter. Anytime we go down there and send our reporters down there, you can really just get a sense of the community there. People just have so much love and respect for the Carters. They were lifelong residents in Plains. The parents lived in Plains, and when we speak about just her lifelong commitment to mental health, like you were saying, it was interesting. I read that, you know, Mrs. Carter, she had a lifelong goal to make mental health not a taboo subject. She wanted people to really take it seriously, and at that time, you know, it wasn't celebrated to say I have a mental health issue. It wasn't popular to have a therapist or anything. And then it's kind of a full circle moment, because then she was diagnosed with dementia. So all of her life's work went into saying, you know, now I'm hoping that somebody will help me.
And the way she embraced caregivers, as we see friends, family, dignitaries, loved ones coming out of different buses that were brought there for this wreath laying ceremony. If you're just joining us, this is at Georgia Southwestern State University in Americus, not too far from Plains, where the former First Lady was born, but where she graduated with a degree in 1946, and then spent many years contributing through the center that she established there as well. You know, she first started understanding caregiving herself when she was 12. Her father was diagnosed with cancer. She watched her own mother serve as a caregiver, work outside the home, raise her and her siblings. She saw that struggle. She understood that. And then later on the campaign trail with Jimmy Carter, when he was running for governor, she met a working mom at a cotton mill, and she just kind of said casually, well, I hope you go home and get some rest. And the mom said to her, I won't be able to rest. I have a daughter with mental illness, and we can't find anywhere to care for her. And it really, that's where it started. And then this quest to help those who were in caregiving roles started really in tandem with their political journey through all the years, and brings us here today. And really significant that this wreath laying ceremony happens where the Rosalynn Carter Institute continues to do that work day in, day out, thinking about how can we better equip and serve caregivers among us. Here they've branched out beyond Georgia, now nationally. We see the back of the hearse, the door is now open as people gather around it. This wreath laying ceremony will happen at a bench with a bronze statue of the former First Lady, which actually she at one point kind of was resistant to because she had such a humble nature, but really significant that today they'll lay that wreath at the feet of the statue of the steel magnolia. This woman with such
and that was her nickname,
soft
right?
presence,
Steel magnolia.
but
and it looks like we
strength.
And it looks like we have some folks coming out of the building right now. I believe these will probably be the people to carry the pallbearers
carrying the casket,
in. We did see the Carter family, the folks that were gathering out who will travel with the motorcade. Mrs. Carter survived, of course, by her husband, Jimmy, her children, Jack, Chip, Jeff, and Amy. She had 11 grandchildren, 14 great-grandchildren. A grandson did pass away in 2015. But as we see right now, we can see Mrs. Carter coming out here.
The casket with a gorgeous array of flowers, and significant that the men you see on both sides of that casket are past and present members of her Secret Service detail. You think about Mrs. Carter was in her 50s when she left the White House, and she had Secret Service with her in all the years since her passing at 96. And they were such a loving and important part of her life, really an extension of her family, as they carefully and with great respect and admiration put the casket of Mrs. Carter into the hearse there.
And you think about the Secret Service detail, I mean, they really do become members of your family. They are in every aspect of your life. They watch you grow up, and through the White House, they watch the kids grow up through the White House. They know family secrets at some point, and you know, they have a life commitment to serve. And so it is really beautiful to see the members of the Secret Service detail be a part of this ceremony. We see that the casket has gone into the hearse, and now it looks like the doors are going to be closed up. But Cheryl, you know, just kind of looking at this and just thinking about the commitment to mental health, what comes to mind, like the biggest accomplishments for Mrs. Carter in your mind?
Well, I think that she made it an important part of everyday conversation, really on both sides of that relationship, which is those who are suffering and those who are caring for people they love who are suffering. And not just to make it part of a conversation, but to have real action in place through her many initiatives, through the conversations, and through the Institute that's now doing work nationally and globally. And this was something that she was very passionate about, but there were so many different parts of her humanitarianism and her advocacy through the Carter Center. I mean, the fact that she and the former president together worked to eradicate guinea worm, which at the time when they took that on was impacting more than 3 million people every year, and this year there are 12 known cases. This is a horrific parasitic disease that infects, children and mothers and families just from drinking contaminated water. So there was so much work that they did, not necessarily the work that would flash on a headline or get clicks, but the work that they knew would make generational and lasting change in people's lives. So as I think about honoring her, as we see her casket in the hearse, flanked by current and former members of the Secret Service, that there are people standing there at Georgia Southwestern State University who knew her intimately, and there are people all over the world who are watching a moment like this and just know of her through the impact that she made. It kind of chokes me up, honestly.
And it's interesting that you mentioned that point, that especially the eradication of guinea worm, that wasn't a big topic that made the national headlines at 10 p.m. every single night. And Mrs. Carter mentioned that even when she was talking about her mental health work, that these topics aren't necessarily sexy. Reporters aren't pounding down the door to get an interview with me talking about my work, but it was important to her. I mean, you're talking about, she's the first First Lady who had an office in the White House and had a full staff. She wasn't just going to work to be a wife. She went to work to put in work and make change happen. I mean, she helped to, she lobbied legislatures to get vaccines instated in schools for children. She had so many accomplishments that when Jimmy went to work, she went to work as well. And even the former president, Mr. Carter, called her his partner in this. She attended cabinet meetings. She went on his behalf to campaign both for governor and then for president. So it is really remarkable and inspiring to see such effort that she put in, and so much, how much passion that she had when she picked a topic and wanted to get that topic. She worked hard to make it happen and really joined with other women, joined with other first ladies, other people who might have been campaigning against them at one point, but really kind of joining together, putting those differences aside and saying, you know what, we can do this, we can work together. And I think it is really telling of the former First Lady as we see the hearse here with the pallbearers, her, like you said.
You make such an important point because, you know, she carried a briefcase to her office in the East Wing, and that was something that had never been done before. And as she sat in cabinet meetings, but she was an integral part in a lot of the decision making. And I've, as the hearse is starting to pull out here at Georgia Southwestern State University, slowly as it'll make its way and take this turn here, that at the same time as she's working on fuel standard legislation, and she is being very integrally part of the decisions about regulations on air and water pollution, or establishing diplomatic relations with China, or the Camp David Accord. She was there during that negotiation. She's also a working mom. She had a 9-year-old daughter in the White House at that time, and there were so many things that really she quietly but very strongly blazed a trail in. And continued to do so after her time in the White House. Former President Carter has said many times that, you know, he felt like it wasn't a takeaway that they didn't have a second term, that he felt that they accomplished as much as they would have wanted to. And he said, now my wife doesn't always agree with me. She really wanted that second term. She loved politics. She said many times, I love politics. Not the back and forth about it, but the being in position to really make a change in people's lives. And that's the way she viewed politics, and maybe that's not the way a lot of people view it anymore, but for her it really is impactful just to see the hands on the hearse. People who walked beside her in life, in many seasons of life. Again, if you're just joining us, the men you see flanking the hearse there with former First Lady Rosalynn Carter are current and past Secret Service members who were by her side every moment of her life, and now by her side as she, you know, has transitioned on.
Yeah, it is just a sight to see, a very sombering moment for the entire community of Plains, the entire country, and really the world who is looking in, because her work has impacted globally. One of our very own who's down in Plains right now, Christy Diaz, was a part of the First Lady's mental health fellowship at the Carter Center. And she was able to put together a piece called Desperately Waiting. And this mental health fellowship from Mrs. Carter was so important for journalists, not just here in the States, but across the world, to bring them together and to give them, you know, resources and opportunity to report and give this important news about mental health. And as we look on here, we could see those members of the Carter family, close friends, as well as members of the community getting ready to see this motorcade leave. And Cheryl, you know, it's a sad day, but it's also a celebration of life.
No doubt a celebration of life. 96 years, a life well lived, a life of service as it's pulling out now here. And as you see on the left side of your screen here, just people lined up along the street. I know we'll see that from this position to the next position with the wreath laying ceremony that will happen. I think we'll see a lot of that, and happy that the weather is cooperating as people are lining this road as the procession here begins. But I think it's very true. I think 96 years of service next to the love of her life, who is 99 years old, who is with her until her final breath, and her family as well, children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren and extended family in her hometown of Plains, a community that very much is a family, a small community that feels very much like she and her husband are and will always be in the fabric of who they are as a community.
And I love her nickname that she was given, because when you take a look at Mrs. Carter and her life and legacy, she's a soft-spoken woman. She was clever, she would make people laugh, but she was also very knowledgeable about what she talked about. When she went out to campaign for Mr. Carter, both during his governorship and then his bid for the White House, when you asked her a question about something, she would give you the facts. If she didn't know, she'd say, you know what, let me get back to you. She was very well versed. She was very, very smart. And her nickname, as we see the Secret Service detail and folks coming back in, the Motorcade is now on its way. But I just really, really love that nickname, Miss Steel Magnolia, her sweetness and her drive, her motivation, which was carried on until, the final days of her life. So that was a very, very beautiful sight.
So the motorcade, they're leaving. It'll head up US 280 and then to Georgia Southwestern State University for that wreath laying ceremony. Here's a look at what's going to be happening today. The Carter family motorcade, as you just saw, left the Phoebe Sumter Medical Center in Americus, heads to Southwestern State University, not a very long drive. At 11 o'clock, that motorcade will arrive at the Rosalynn Carter Health and Human Science Complex at the school. That's where the wreath will be laid. That's where her bronze statue sits on a bench there. Afterwards, the motorcade will make its way towards the Carter Presidential Center in Atlanta.
So, like I was saying before, one of our very own, Christy Diaz, she's actually very close, very knowledgeable, and she participated in the fellowship at the Carter Center for Global Journalism. We want to take it live now to Christy Diaz. She's on the campus of Georgia Southwestern State. Christy, we know how close you are to Mrs. Carter's mission for mental health. Can you paint a picture for us right now? How are you doing? How are the people of Plains doing right now?
That's such a good question, because I think this is a day that everyone is feeling the weight and the heaviness and the gravity of. Caregiving is a passion that I certainly shared with Mrs. Carter and worked with her on a project that I did about the gaps in dementia care. But even for people who haven't met her or the people who have known her whole life, it's one that is filled with mixed emotions today. Let me set the scene for you here. We are on the campus of Georgia Southwestern, only about 3 miles away from Phoebe Sumter Medical Center. That's less than a 10-minute drive. We have many people from the public, look off to my right here, who have gathered to watch the wreath-laying ceremony this morning, which will happen at 11 o'clock. And they are looking across the street at the building, one of the buildings that is named after Mrs. Carter, and in front of the building, a courtyard that holds a statue of her, a bronze statue. And yes, she did protest that statue because of her humble nature. However, she was deeply grateful that these two buildings bore her name. The building you're looking at here holds the nursing building, and the building behind this one that is out of view is the building that houses the Rosalynn Carter Institute for Caregivers and also the psychology department. Here, right there at that statue, is where the president of the university, Neil Weaver, and the CEO of the Rosalynn Carter Institute, Dr. Jennifer Olson, will each lay a wreath right next to that statue. And that is what we are waiting on, for the family and the motorcade to arrive to honor her in that way. Earlier this morning, we spoke with the CEO of the Rosalynn Carter Institute, Dr. Jennifer Olson, who has worked hand in hand with Mrs. Carter since she took over in 2018, and talked about how this day brings so many mixed emotions.
Today is a day with both sorrow and joy. We're sad to have lost Mrs. Carter last week, but also we're really excited to see people come out and celebrate her amazing legacy starting today. To start off talking about caregivers, what's a more appropriate beginning to these services?
Truly, and that is her legacy that so many people are talking about today. And one of the things that Dr. Olson is probably most proud of, and she says will give her strength over the next few days, is the fact that caregiving has become a headline and a conversation again. It's what people are talking about, and that would make Mrs. Carter happy. You know, when we arrived last night, it was drizzly, it was cold, and now this morning as the sun has risen, it is bright and shining, and it feels a little warmer, and it seems to mirror the emotional state of the town, you know, the mixed and the different edges and the different extremes of what people are feeling, sad and drizzly, and both warm and sunny as people reminisce and think about Mrs. Carter. Guys, back to you.
You know, Christy, we were talking about her kind of inherent love of politics, and really much of that started there on the campus. She was very involved in politics and student leadership there on campus, even before she married a future president.
That is true. She was very involved. She was Rosalynn Smith when she was a student here on campus. She was a student marshal. She was vice president of her class. She was a founding member of the Young Democrats Club. She was also part of the tumbling club. And so she was very active here on campus. As she grew and as she joined President Carter in a relationship that would last 77 years, it's pretty widely known that she had the more politically cunning mind and thought more about the political consequences than he did, and became his #1 partner in helping him make decisions that would help him or warn him about the ones that could hurt him politically. But certainly it is here that got her start, and she is in her own right an individual that had so much wisdom and so much intelligence to bring to this relationship when they eventually landed in the White House. Cheryl and Faith.
And Christy, I do believe we're having some live pictures coming up soon, but while we still have you, I did want to ask you about just your experience working with the Carter Center. We know that while Mrs. Carter had many programs that she did with her husband, former President Jimmy Carter, the program that you participated in was one that bared her name. I believe maybe the only program that has bared her name. Can you talk to us a little bit about your experience and what you as a journalist experienced through that program?
Absolutely. I'll tell you hands down, it's the best and hardest thing I have ever done, aside from raising a child. Working with the Carter Center and tangentially with Mrs. Carter. You are right, even though she co-founded the Carter Center, so half of what the Carter Center does is directly related to her. This fellowship program that helps train journalists is the only one named after her that bears her name, and she was immensely proud of this fellowship program. It has been going on for 40 years. More than 250 journalists have gone through and been trained by some of the top experts in the field. I was lucky enough to be one of them. It was a pretty intense application process. You had to go through several discussions and interviews. You had to pitch a project and a topic that you wanted to tackle related to mental health, and then write a paper explaining what you would do and how you could help find solutions for it. And of course, my project was inspired by my own personal story of caregiving when I helped care for my father. My mother did too, and so did my sister. When he had an early onset Alzheimer's diagnosis, we also later found out there was some Lewy body dementia in there as well. And that process went on for several years, and it is one where I had a front row seat to the gaps in care. If it is my job as a professional to research and find out information, and I was having a difficult time, I could only imagine how difficult it is for everyone else out there who may not have the same resources I did. And so it became my mission, through help from the Carter Center, Mrs. Carter, and my colleagues at 11 Alive, to find out and tell the story of people living with dementia through their own words, and maybe make that process and the education and the knowledge that I got through that process a little bit easier for someone else. And it is a project that now I am immensely proud to call myself a Carter Fellow. Each time I was part of the cohort in 2020, right in the middle of the pandemic, so we were all trying to figure out how to navigate things virtually. So all of our trainings were virtual, but every time we kicked off a training, Mrs. Carter would come online and she would speak to us. She would tell us how important it was, the work we were doing, and it's something that I will remember forever. And it looks like the motorcade is just starting to arrive here on the campus of Georgia Southwestern University. So let's watch it as they roll in.
If you're just joining us, you are looking live at a picture of a group gathering right outside of Georgia Southwestern State University. The hearse carrying former First Lady Rosalynn Carter has just arrived within about the last 30 seconds. It arrived from its first stop, which is at the Phoebe Medical Center in Sumter County, at the Phoebe Sumter Medical Center in Americus. It's just arrived. As people gather, there will be 2 wreath-laying ceremonies there in front of the building. As people are lining the roads there, we saw that happening outside of Phoebe Sumter Medical Center in Americus as well. People had lined the roads there as the hearse made its way here to Georgia Southwestern State University for this part of the day. This is the first in 3 days of events honoring the life of and legacy of former First Lady Rosalynn Carter.
And as we just saw there, if you all were watching, you could really feel the heaviness in the air, but also a celebration of life for Mrs. Carter. She was loved dearly by her entire community here in Plains, by her university, which she attended before marrying Mr. Carter. And there's a lot of family down in Plains, family both by blood and by profession. We saw her Secret Service detail, who will act as the palm bearers, past and present. And what Cheryl and I were talking about 20 minutes ago or so is how much of a family they have become as well. As we look on, we see law enforcement here. We see everyone preparing for this wreath laying. We spoke with Christy Diaz, who says, there's a bronze statue of Mrs. Carter here on the campus that she fought against because she was just so humble in nature. And as we're watching now, We see the law enforcement officer walking. And I believe we will look on, there's the bronze statue that I was just talking about there, as you can see. And I believe this is the Rosalynn Carter Institute caregiver CEO, Jennifer Olson. She's one of the 2 people who will place 2 wreaths at Mrs. Carter's bronze statue. So that's who we're looking at right now.
Jennifer Olson has done tremendous work for caregiving, and to not just do that work here in Georgia, the former First Lady's home state, but across the country, and has talked a lot with 11 Alive reporter Christy Diaz about the commitment to continue that work and to not only continue Mrs. Carter's legacy, but to build on it. And here is the second wreath that will be placed at the statue.
And this is Georgia Southwestern State University President Neil Weaver placing this wreath as we look on and listen on.
Significant to see the bronze statue of Mrs. Carter there on the bench. As she sits alone there on the bench, her image of a steel magnolia, someone with great compassion and care for the people around her, but the tenacity and strength to make sure she got things done, and that will continue to be the case on that campus and far beyond, as now people will walk by and pay their respects. You just feel this deep respect, I think, and gratitude. No matter what side of the aisle one might find themselves on, there is this bipartisan respect for the humanitarian work that they both did for all of their adult lives, and really setting the tone and setting the bar for what a former president and first lady can accomplish in those years. You know, you think back, they were so young when they left the White House. You know, former president was 56 years old, and she 3 years his junior, 96 at the time of her passing in Plains just a few days ago. Amazing accomplishments in a single life.
And you know, I feel like Mrs. Carter had so many one-liners that just really made you laugh and smile, even in the midst of, you know, serious issues. But one of my favorite lines that she said, she called Mr. Carter's departure from the White House an involuntary retirement.
Yes. She said, I thought we'd go back to Plains and be bored out of our minds. She said that certainly was not the case, and by design. You know, she was also an author, wrote a number of books alongside her husband. They wrote at least one together. But the really work in some ways began after the White House in so many ways, through the Carter Center and beyond, for certain.
And I mean, you know, you speak to people and folks who have lived through his administration. People know that towards the end he wasn't the most popular president, but the work didn't stop there. Both for Mr. Carter and Mrs. Carter, they continued to fight. They opened the Carter Center, and what Mr. Carter was saying is, like, you know what, we want to have a place like Camp David in Georgia, where people can come and we can make deals, we can actually make change. And it was established, and it has in fact made a lot of change. We were speaking about the eradication of guinea worm. We spoke with Christy about her fellowship there. There are just several programs that continue to come out of the Carter Center. And those of us who live in Atlanta, many of us have gone. I went and saw Stacey Abrams speak for something at the Carter Center. So just lots of different events, a lot of different programs and passions that are continued, that really just are continuing the legacy that Mrs. Carter worked so hard for. And it really is just a day to, once again, it's a sad day for the residents of Plains, for the country, but it's a day of hope, a day to look forward. How can we continue her legacy?
As the hearse now slowly leaves Georgia Southwestern State University, after the 2 wreaths were placed there in front of the bronze statue of Mrs. Carter, what you're seeing is vehicles carrying loved ones. The Carters have 11 grandchildren, 14 great-grandchildren, of course, 4 children. Their daughter, Amy Carter, was in the White House with them as a young girl, a 9-year-old, when she went with her parents to the White House.
Yes.
And we see that long line of loved ones following along. Of course, you can't see this line without thinking about former President Jimmy Carter, who was with his wife until the final moment. His grandson was talking about the fact then when Mrs. Carter entered hospice and she declined quite quickly, that the former president asked that his bed be moved right towards the end of her bed so that it could be right next to each other, and that he held her hand until the very end. And when she took her final breath, he asked everyone in the room just to clear the room for a moment, that he just needed a few moments alone with his wife. And you think about a lifetime connection that really started, you know, in a hospital room when Jimmy Carter was 3 and she was a newborn, and how their lives intersected. You know, she saw a picture of Jimmy Carter on her friend Ruth's wall as a teenager and said, "That's a handsome young man." And and Ruth, his sister, helped set them up. And wow, what a incredible life together and impact together. And I think when we see the crowds lining the fence there, just wanting to take this moment to say thank you and pay their respects, you feel maybe the depth of the impact one life can make.
And you know, there's not too many people in Plains, but a lot of people have traveled near and far to be here just to get a glimpse of the motorcade passing by, just to be a part of this moment of history, because she really did impact so many lives. And we can see the police escort starting to come now, the motorcycles coming down.
So the next stop for this motorcade will be coming towards Atlanta. They'll take I-75 into Atlanta, and I think with great significance take the John Lewis Freedom Parkway as they then will go to the Carter Center. And I think you'll see a lot of people lining the streets and highways between there and here, and a lot of people in the next 3 days of ceremonies honoring her life, to take a moment like the crowds you see there along the street there at Georgia Southwestern State University there in Americus, to take a moment to be part of this next part of history, really.
Next era. And it's really telling, you know, it's interesting to see who will, I guess, take the baton that Mrs. Carter has put out there. She devoted her life to service. She was a first lady. She was a wife of a president. She was a wife of a governor. But she was working. She was his partner. Actually, I have a quote from Mrs. Carter here, or Mr. Carter rather, here, saying, "Rosalynn was my equal partner in everything I ever accomplished. She gave me wise guidance and encouragement when I needed it. As long as Rosalynn was in the world, I always knew someone loved and supported me." And what I love about their love story, every single night they read the Bible together, they prayed, he taught Sunday school, and he was just so in love with Rosalynn.
Sometimes they do that in Spanish because they said they wanted to make sure that they kept up on their Spanish as well. And there's a funny story there. Former President Carter once said that, you know, their anniversary kind of came up on and surprised him, and he woke up in the morning and said, "Oh, it's our anniversary." So he said, "I wrote a very nice handwritten card and said, anything you'd like as a gift, honey." And she said, "Just bring me a cup of coffee and a kiss every morning." And he did that from that point on, which was in the late 80s until they could no longer do that anymore.
Oh my goodness.
So you see there Georgia State President Neil Weaver and Rosalynn Carter Institute for Caregivers CEO Jennifer Olson walking back towards the wreaths that they placed there at the bronze statue of Mrs. Carter. Again, This is on the Georgia Southwestern State University campus. Christy Diaz is there and has been covering this for us. I'm curious, Christy, as you are there on the ground, what's the sense and the mood of the people around you?
Surprisingly emotional, especially considering many of the people here have never met the former First Lady, Mrs. Carter, but it was clear as the motorcade came into view and the hearse stopped in front of the building named after her, a reverent silence kind of blanketed the whole area, and people stood. Several of the members of the community that were off to my right behind the barricades were holding and waving American flags, and every member of the press, and there are several cameras here, all surrounded me. Everyone was silent out of respect, especially as Dr. Olson, the President Weaver, the university president, and members of the Carter family walked through and shook each of their hands after the wreaths were laid. Now, I do want to show you, you guys were talking about some of the books, and I think this is an interesting tidbit. Jojo, if you could pan in, zoom in on the statue for me, because this statue, last night when we got here, we walked around and we looked, took a closer look at the statue. It's hard to see from here, but there is a book laying in her lap as part of the statue, and the cover of that book says First Lady from Plains. It is one of the books, one of the many that she wrote, and when you talk about their legacy and history together, she was a very skilled writer, and yes, she and President Carter co-wrote a book together. They talk about it being one of the more contentious moments of their marriage, one of the more difficult times of them working together. They could work on world policy and world peace and disease, but writing a book together seemed to be difficult for them. And to see the First Lady from Plains, that book sitting on her lap as part of that statue, it is emotional to think about the impact that she has made. And another one of the books is about making the most of the rest of your life, which is exactly what they did. There are very few people who can say that their legacy post-presidency shines as brightly as what they did in the White House. Just one more example of the impact that this Carter family has made. But the emotion here on the ground, it's palpable. You can hear as the students still are walking around the campus heading to class. Employees are too. The public still gathered. It is still a reverent quietness here as the motorcade has now moved on and heading toward Atlanta for another couple of days worth of honoring Mrs. Carter's life. But it certainly feels like an honor to be here and witness this moment in person. Cheryl and Faith.
I love that story, Christy. That was her first book. It was published, I think, in 1984. And I think because she did transform the role of a First Lady, and I think it has been different since that time. Maybe at that time it was seen as different, but in the years past, I think we see and can understand and appreciate even more how transformative that really was. So it's significant that that is the book that's on her lap in that statue. I appreciate you sharing that story. All right. Mrs. Rosalynn Carter, awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1999, inducted into the National Women's Hall of Fame in 2001, a humanitarian, an author, a First Lady, a governor's wife, and just someone who cared deeply about people and whose life will live on through the legacy that she leaves us all. This is the first in a full day of events that will celebrate her life, and the first of 3 days of events from Plains to Americus to Atlanta and back.
And the president and his wife, Dr. Jill Biden, Vice President Kamala Harris, and her husband will be coming down tomorrow. And then the funeral will take place on Wednesday. We want to talk about the ceremonies that are taking place over the next few days. You can watch them right here on 11 Alive Plus and our YouTube channel. We are going to have crews. I'll actually be going down to Plains on Wednesday. Cheryl, I know you'll be here talking about anchoring the coverage for all of the things here. And we are just going to have wall-to-wall coverage for talking about her life her programs that she pushed for, her passions, and of course her long-lasting impact as the steel magnolia she was.
And we'll have more coverage today as the casket comes to the Carter Center this afternoon, set to arrive around 2:30, and 11 Alive News will have you covered each and every step of the way. Thank you for joining for our special coverage. We'll be back later this afternoon.